Hello, everyone. Welcome once again. Welcome to this fifth day of the 2022 Virtual Island Summit. My name is Stacey Alvarez de la Campa. I am the Community Manager and Ambassador Program Coordinator here at Island Innovation. I'm based in Barbados. And I'm very, very excited to be presenting this session. This session is entitled Invasive Species in the Caribbean. And we're very grateful and happy for the sponsorship of the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience of the Cayman Islands. And this is a ministry that was established in 2021 and really seeks to honor that intrinsic link between sustainability and building a robust way to withstand the effects of climate change. This is a ministry which has a very forward-thinking and multi-stakeholder approach and is committed to achieving environmental, social, and economic balance to maximize all the benefits of all the work that they do. So thanks so much to the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience of the Cayman Islands. So before we begin our session, I can let you know there's a poll. You should see a poll coming up right now on your screen. And this is to, I invite you to fill out this poll, let us know where you're joining us from. Please use the chat box and let us know where you're coming from. And in this instance as well, you'll see in the poll that you're going to be asked about the sector or the industry that you're in, just so we can get an idea of who is here. Again, feel free to say hi in the chat box. Let us know what you think of the session. And I'll also encourage you to use the question and answer box for any questions that you might have. Okay, I see people are here coming from St. Lucia, big shout out to St. Lucia, coming from South Africa as well, that's awesome. I'm gonna say hi to the Cayman Islands as well, that's fantastic. Please keep introducing yourselves. Thank you so much for joining today. And this should give you enough time to fill out our poll. I see people from Puerto Rico, yay, from Colombia and from the UK. Excellent, it's great to see so many people here. Okay, so it looks as if the vast majority of participants today are in the Caribbean. That's fantastic. And we have Europe coming in second. So welcome to all our Caribbean respondents, as well as everyone from North America, South and Central America, Pacific as well. Most people are in the private sector, closely followed by NGOs. So we also have, though, the presence of people in the government sector. So again, echoing that multi-stakeholder approach that's so important. And everyone mostly belongs to the environment, services, or oceans conservation sector, okay, which is very important. We know that anything to do with, I think, invasive species covers generally can feed into that area. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce everyone to our moderator today. Our moderator is Hannah Reid. She is the communication specialist with the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience in the government of the Cayman Islands. Hannah, you can turn on your camera and join me on screen. Thanks again for your part in this year's Virtual Island Summit, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Really appreciate that. Good day and welcome to our panelists and to everyone tuning in from around the world. We're going to open our session today titled Invasive Species in the Caribbean with a special video message from the Premier of the Cayman Islands and Minister of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency, the Honorable G. Wayne Panton. Let's watch.
In the deepest part of the Caribbean Sea, 3 remote islands rise up from the depths. Grand Cayman is the largest and most cosmopolitan of our islands. Cayman Brac, distinguished by its towering bluff, and Little Cayman, a nature lover's paradise. As the United Kingdom Overseas Territory, the Cayman Islands is one of 14 territories that together contain 94% of the UK's biodiversity. Our national tree, silver thatch, our national flower, the banana orchid, our national bird, the Cayman parrot, and the charismatic blue iguana and sister islands rock iguana are species found nowhere else in the world. Good day, my name is Wayne Panton, and I am the Premier of the Cayman Islands and Minister for the first Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency established in the Cayman Islands, and perhaps the Caribbean. I am delighted to be speaking at Island Innovation's 2022 Virtual Island Summit. The focus of our panel today is a challenge many island communities around the world are facing. That is invasive alien species. Now, our speakers today include representatives from the Cayman Islands government, Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency, the Department of Environment, the National Trust for the Cayman Islands Blue Iguana Conservation Program, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. These are the on-the-ground subject matter experts leading the Cayman Islands in our efforts to manage the threat of invasive species such as green iguanas, lionfish, brown rats, and other feral mammals. As many of you will know firsthand, invasive species are more than just a nuisance. These non-native plants and animals significantly modify or disrupt the ecosystems they enter and can cause devastating environmental and economic harm. Now, around the world, invasive species are a top driver of biodiversity loss. What is also becoming increasingly apparent is the potential for climate change to greatly exacerbate the impacts of invasive species. Climate change threatens almost all aspects of life for island communities. In addition to the spread of invasive species, climate change is also impacting the spread of biological pathogens. In the Cayman Islands, we are working to monitor, assess, and respond to novel diseases such as stony coral tissue loss disease and a new disease affecting some countries in our region, which causes nearly 100% mortality of long-spined sea urchins, a keystone grazer of algae on our coral reefs. We know these threats to our biodiversity are connected. Global environmental change is wreaking havoc on natural systems that have sustained life for millennia. Though small island nations contribute the least to global greenhouse emissions, we're on the front lines of climate change. Collectively, we are the canaries in the coal mine for evidence of a rapidly warming world, rising sea levels, the spread of invasive species, and the emergence of novel diseases. But that also means we are often the ones leading the charge for on-the-ground responses to these issues. And we have a lot of lessons to share with the world. The experts you will hear from today are experts and leaders in their field who spend their days and sometimes nights and weekends working tirelessly to protect our unique habitats and our incredible native and endemic species. For us, the threat of invasive species and new diseases is not abstract. It affects animals and plants we have worked hard to protect through conservation programs and environmental legislation. These are living, breathing creatures, and we are proud to share our islands with them. I hope you come away from this panel today with practical information on biosecurity and invasive species management, knowledge of the partnerships available to support such efforts, and also a greater appreciation for the importance of this work and the valuable role invasive species management plays in protecting biodiversity around the world. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the discussions.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask all of our panelists to join me with your videos on now, please. So as the Premier mentioned, today's panel is focused on the threat of invasive species and novel diseases in the Caribbean and how the Cayman Islands is managing these dynamic conservation challenges. My name is Hannah Reed, and I am the Communications Specialist for the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency here in the Cayman Islands. And as Stacey noted, our ministry was created last year as part of the current administration's efforts to cultivate a lasting legacy of sustainability in the Cayman Islands. I'm joined today by Luke Harding, Blue Iguana Conservation Operations Manager with the National Trust for the Cayman Islands, Marique Cloutey, Community Engagement Officer with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, Tanya Lasser, Biosecurity Officer with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and Tim Austin, Deputy Director of the Department of Environment. As Premier Panton said, these are the on-the-ground experts when it comes to managing invasive species and responding to novel diseases affecting our native and endemic flora and fauna. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you for being here today. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for the panelists during the segment, please submit them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them as many as possible as we can in the time we have. I'll start with a sort of general question for Tim. Not all non-native species classify an alien species as invasive.
Hannah, I really apologize there, but I think it broke up briefly and I missed the question. I hope we're not going to be plagued with problems.
No problem. I can repeat it. It was a question about the fact that not all non-native species become invasive. So what are some of the factors that classify an alien species as invasive?
That's a great first question. Yeah, obviously there's exotic species and invasive species. So exotic species are ones that probably shouldn't be here, but they're not really problematic. But then exotic species that turn into problems then get classified as invasive species. Those are the ones that, as the Premier pointed out, start to really disrupt the ecosystem. They start to get populations out of control and basically impact the biodiversity. So an exotic species, just one that shouldn't be here, got here inadvertently, can't really survive, versus one that's really thriving and having huge impacts to the local biodiversity.
So I think the Premier mentioned a couple of the species that immediately come to mind, perhaps for people in the Cayman Islands because they're so visible to us, the lionfish, the green iguanas, but there are other invasive species that we might not think about. What other invasive species are on the Department of Environment's radar?
Okay, yeah, there's a whole host. So particularly in the marine environment, there's quite a few bivalves that have been introduced, mussels. There's algae that are beginning to come problematic. Cayman's a bit fortunate that we don't have too many of those to deal with at the moment. We have a fairly resilient ecosystem. Obviously, the most iconic invasive species for the marine environment in the Caribbean was the lionfish, or is the lionfish. Potentially not as problematic as first thought, but certainly it's an iconic one. Terrestrially, I get a little bit out of my depth. My marine sciences background is kind of where I tend to focus, but I do know that there's a lot of problems in the terrestrial environment. Obviously, rats and cats and the kind of more classic animals that have been with us for a long time are really having a huge impact locally. And those are, I think, some of the species that we focus on. In the terrestrial environment with the plants, I know that beach casuarinas, I always find that interesting that trees that people love here, the Australian pine, it's actually classed as an invasive due to the impact it has on the beach environment. So those are some of the more common or well-established ones that I'm aware of.
Thank you. I want to move to a question for Luke, because I suspect there are some people in the audience who are hearing about blue iguanas and perhaps seeing blue iguanas for the first time. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work the Blue Iguana Conservation Program does? What makes these reptiles so unique, and how invasive species are or can potentially impact the blue iguanas?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. Blue Iguana Conservation is a program managed under the National Trust for the Cayman Islands that focuses on conservation efforts for the Grand Cayman blue iguana. Blue Iguana Conservation is made up of local and international organisations who have formed a stable partnership over the last 22 years that has led to the world's most successful reptile conservation stories to date. It brought this species back from functional extinction. In 2002, there was less than 30 individuals, right through to releasing the 1,000th blue iguana into the wild in 2018. So although undoubtedly a remarkable story of conservation optimism and a globally recognised project, there's still a long way to go. Our work now focuses on maintaining the wild population, looking into threats as the population changes and how we can mitigate those threats, and education and outreach and ensuring it's got a future, and aiming to achieve our vision of establishing and maintaining a population of wild iguanas long term and ensuring that they are supported and celebrated as a flagship species. So we're very fortunate here that both of our islands have beautiful iguanas, but Grand Cayman has something else to be really fortunate about, and that is our iguana happens to be bright blue. This means that this eye-striking beauty helps this species elevate its public profile, its marketability, and it makes it stand out, which is something that a lot of reptile species don't have the fortune to be so pretty, so marketable as the blue iguana. And combine this with the remarkable conservation story of this species, and it sets it up to be a real natural gem of the Cayman Islands that can be celebrated on an international platform and enjoyed because it's endemic and can be found nowhere else in the world. In regards to the threats that invasive species pose to the blue iguanas, they are a huge risk to the blue iguana population. Introduced predators such as cats and dogs predate on iguanas of all ages, and our recent work shows that these threats have been identified as some of the biggest threats to the recovery of the blue iguana population in the wild, primarily due to the pressure that these predators put on the smaller age categories, the young iguanas, which affects recruitment and the growth of the wild population and means that the species remains conservation dependent. We then have issues such as emerging diseases, hybridization, and competition for resources brought on by species such as the green iguanas, which we'll talk about. And there's other indirect threats that come from species that aren't as well known. So these are examples of species we do know, and we can monitor, but there's the impacts that could be there from other threats, such as agricultural pests that might affect plant species and the fauna of these islands that the iguanas rely on to provide habitat and diet. So invasive species can have a huge impact for the blue iguanas, and it's important that discussions like this now are being had to look at ways that we can work together to mitigate these threats.
Thank you, Luke. I want to go now to Marie Quintana, because you both have experience not just with the blue iguana's cousin, the sister islands rock iguana, but also some incredible bird species that call our sister islands home, either year-round or for breeding purposes. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the species that your work is focused on in Cayman Brac and Little Cayman, and what are some of the threats from invasive species there?
Hi, thanks, Hannah. And it's really great to join you guys today. Really glad you're asking about birds, because at the moment it is wild out there. Like, I had a real moment yesterday where I had to decide, prepare for this panel or go birding and wing it. And I think I reached somewhere in the middle. It's really great. Cayman Islands is blessed with some fantastic birds. We have some great local seabirds, shorebirds, waders, songbirds. But then, as I said, we also have these migrants coming through that either breed on our island, overwinter here, or just use it as a really crucial stopover in their very mammoth journeys. So some of the sort of iconic species for the sister islands would be the resident breeding brown booby in Cayman Brac, and then my favorite white-tailed tropic bird, which is a migrant breeder in Cayman Brac, and they're really gorgeous. They have these long tails and they do these aerial acrobatics for courtships, really wonderful to witness. And then, of course, in Little Cayman, we have the breeding populations of the red-footed booby birds and the magnificent frigate birds, and they all breed in Booby Pond, which is incidentally the territory's only Ramsar protected site, and well worth a visit if anyone hasn't gone there yet. And then we have some amazing other migrant breeders, such as the Antillean nighthawk and the least tern, and those two are both ground nesting birds, similar to the brown booby, which makes them particularly vulnerable to the threat of invasive species by predation. And if you would venture further into the woodlands, you would see the red-legged thrush, or old thrush as it's called here, and the Cayman Brac parrot, and both of those are endemic subspecies, so they are only found in Cayman Brac in the whole world, which makes them really special. And then you have some further sort of things that draw birders are the Vitaleen Warbler, which again is found only in the Cayman Islands and in the Swan Islands in Honduras. So, West Indian whistling ducks. I don't know anyone who doesn't love watching those little fuzzy ducks grow up. So yeah, I could go on, but I won't because we would be here forever. But basically just RSPB is very associated with birds. However, the primary drivers for sort of our Darwin project are actually the reptiles here. So you mentioned the sister islands rock iguana, but we also have some very cryptic reptiles such as the Cayman dwarf ground boa and the Cayman Brac blind snake. And those are species we're really hoping to understand better as our project continues. And I will maybe hand over to Tanya to tell us a little bit about the threats of invasive species.
Thank you very much, Marique. Yeah, so as Marique said, like, the Sister Islands are amazing. If you haven't visited yet, please go and do so. Yeah, so there is a lot of native wildlife out there, and as Marique just mentioned, a lot of endemic wildlife that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So it is really our responsibility to make sure that we give them the best chance of survival and not even making their life harder by allowing invasive species to come into the islands and thrive there. So yeah, I want to make sure that everybody like understands the whole picture. Like ecosystems, they are well functioning systems that have evolved for thousands and millions of years. So everybody has their own role to play in those ecosystems. Species have co-involved, give each other resources, and have other roles that they play. And if we as people, if we humans bring anything in or take anything out, that whole balance, that just collapses. And this is just a big problem that invasive species cause, that the balance is just not there anymore naturally. So whatever we bring in as additional predators, what the dogs and cats were mentioned earlier, for example, like our baby iguanas, they don't know those threats. They have never encountered a cat or a dog yet. So when a baby iguana sees a snake that are native here to the Sister Islands, they run away. But if they see a cat, they're just looking at it and wonder what it is. So they don't have that natural fear. And this is what makes island ecosystems, because the species there are so naive, if you want to call it that, makes them even more vulnerable to threats from the outside. And then there are indirect and direct threats. Indirect threats are, like Luke mentioned earlier, like green iguanas eating plants and destroying plant life, which is habitat, food source, and nesting ground for other animals, or direct effects when green iguanas eat the bird eggs, or when they pass on diseases just by their existence in a place where they're not supposed to be. And this is why biosecurity is so important. And I'm sure I will get into that a little bit more on a later stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. I want to come back to something you touched on there, and then we'll circle back to the Darwin Plus grant and learn a little bit more about that. But one of the things you brought up was the way that ecosystems have evolved, so that everything has its role, its place. And I wanted to ask Luke and Tim about why it is that, what it makes species like the green iguana and the lionfish, which exist in other places without causing harm, what are some of the things that they have in their behavior or their biology that enables them to become an invasive species in our context?
I'm happy to jump in with that, Hannah, with the lionfish, because it's really a good example. It's not actually what they have, as Tanya pointed out, it's what the ecosystem doesn't have. So lionfish, for instance, obviously from the Pacific, they don't reach the size they reach here, and they don't get to anything like the densities or have the devastating impact that they do in the Pacific, because literally, as Tanya mentioned, the ecosystems have evolved. The species that they prey on recognize them. There are fish have pretty unique life cycles, and lionfish have a slightly different version of that. And we think that a lot of the predation that happens with lionfish in the Pacific probably happens at the planktonic stage, the juvenile stages, when they're much more vulnerable. That mechanism, that break, if you like, just does not exist in the Caribbean. So when the lionfish get established, as Tanya mentioned, the species are naive, they do not know how to react. There are also species that just don't know how to eat them. So all of the typical control mechanisms that are in place are just missing. And that allows these animals to just completely thrive and eventually dominate and cause immense damage to the ecosystem.
Thanks, Tim. Luke, did you have anything you wanted to add from the green iguana side?
No, I think that Tim's points he highlights for the lionfish are a great example, and kind of a following theme that green iguanas have different adaptations to where they're being able to survive, where they naturally occur in Central and South America. They have a different biology upbringing to predation and responses, and that's enabled them to be better suited, to be more adaptable to the challenges that species are facing here now on Grand Cayman. So they have more natural response to predation. They are more adaptable to be able to nest and to breed, and their diet variation allows them to thrive better in other areas. And then you've got biological things such as their reproductive biology, which is completely different to that of the blue iguanas. They can have up to 5 times the number of eggs per season compared to what the native iguanas can have. So all these things just mean that they're evolutionarily evolved to be able to do better here and adapt to some of the challenges than the blue and the sister island rock iguanas are at that speed.
Thank you. I want to come back now to Marie Catania to learn a little bit more about the Darwin Plus grant for safeguarding Cayman's sister islands from invasive species. And my understanding is that this is a project that is occurring from last year, continuing up to 2024, and involves partnerships between the Department of Environment, the Department of Agriculture, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and the University of Aberdeen. So can you tell us a little bit more about the main aims of the project and some of the things you're working on right now?
Thanks, Hannah. Yes, great introduction to the project. So essentially, as you mentioned, this is a Darwin-funded project in partnership with a few key agencies. Our main sort of objectives on these projects, we have sort of 4 tier objectives. The first is to really strengthen biosecurity across all 3 of the islands, and that will be following a multi-agency approach. Tanya is definitely going to tell us a bit more about that. But then the second would be to really strengthen community engagement and sort of start conversations so that we can work towards collaborative responses to some of these really emerging issues. And the third would be, as I mentioned earlier, we have some really cryptic reptiles, right? That the distribution, threats, it's all really unknown to us. So as part of this project is partnering with the University of Aberdeen, and researchers will come down and sort of hopefully do some studies to help us understand those species more widely. And then, of course, finally, the hope is that we can implement some really effective and robust invasive species management and controls. And just for clarity, the 3 species that our project is focusing on are the green iguanas, feral cats, and then, of course, rodents. They are by no means the only invasive species, but they are the ones that we've identified we may be able to have an impact on. And I think Tanya has some information for us on biosecurity that she's been working on. She can share.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Yeah, biosecurity gets more and more important all over the world, actually. I think first I would like to just put a definition out there. What is biosecurity, right? So biosecurity is a term that describes all measures that prevent non-native and invasive, potentially invasive plant and animal species to arrive in a place where they do not naturally occur, right? So that just means, again, to reduce the risk of invasive species arriving in a place. So it starts basically at home. Like I've heard it in the conference before, and I like to repeat that when somebody said biosecurity starts in your house. Like, why are you closing the door? Because you do want to keep rodents or insects, even flies, mosquitoes out of your house. That is biosecurity, because this is where it's not naturally occur, right? So this is when you project that to the world, like as the world gets better connected every day, and shipments get easier, traveling gets easier and faster, and the risk of invasive species traveling over islands, countries, and even continents, like that risk really increases day by day. And so the more the invasive species spread all over the world, the more likely is it that each little spot in the world would get any of those species, because then they are at the ports of origin, right? So yeah, I'm not sure how much I am supposed to go into detail in biosecurity just yet, but just for the project, I want to say, so the aim is to come up with a multi-agency biosecurity plan at the end of the project for the sister islands, especially. So as it was mentioned before, this is a 2.5-year project. So it's very limited time for a lot of work and that we can do, or what should be done in terms of biosecurity. And this is why the project focuses on inter-island biosecurity right now to keep the sister islands safe. But at the end of the project, our hope, our goal is that to keep this momentum going and to make sure that biosecurity is a topic that is always addressed and never forgotten again. We hope that a permanent biosecurity officer position can be embedded in the Cayman Islands government at the end of the project, which would be very, very important to focus on the international biosecurity as well. Because when I'm talking about inter-island biosecurity, that means invasive species that we already have on the island going between the islands, especially. But to reduce that risk as well, we have to make sure that nothing gets even on any of those islands, not even to Grand Cayman, which receives very, very many containers every week, or shipments or flights with a lot of passengers and their luggage every single day, right? So this is just for the future. We hope that we can come up with a plan that everybody on the ground will be happy with, that we put procedures in place. Easiest ones would just be for inter-island shipping. When building material is shipped to the sister islands, very often I was inspecting the barges in Little Cayman, and very often just a very easy measure would be just block the sides of the PVC pipes before you ship them, because green iguanas, rats, other invasive species would love to hide in there and just hitchhike over to the sister islands.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, I think everyone would be surprised to know that even, I think it was last year, we had 2 raccoons travel by container to the Cayman Islands. And that was, I think, a moment of surprise for a lot of people that something like that could happen. But it absolutely is one of those risks of invasive species that's tied up with issues of global trade and international travel. We have a couple questions in the chat about the measures that we're actually using to control the invasive species we already have. So biosecurity sounds like that's on the end, the front end sort of the solution. And then we've got obviously control and eradication methods that are being used to deal with the invasive species we do have. And I think it's a timely question because this weekend is actually the 35th tournament for culling lionfish. And it's, so I don't know, Tim, but also Tanya, Marie, Luke, if anyone wants to chime in about some of the ongoing efforts that the Cayman Islands is utilizing to control invasive species like lionfish and green iguanas.
Yeah, sure, and I'm happy to just quickly talk about the lionfish. Others may want to carry on with the green iguana, but so lionfish were first identified in the Caribbean, I think 1999, off the east coast of Florida. Likely got there from the aquarium trade. They rapidly spread through the Caribbean, and there were a lot of people working, investigating the threat. So we were well aware of potentially how bad they could be if they ever got to Cayman, and we started to do kind of background outreach to make divers and people that were in the water be aware and to keep an eye out for them. Our first report came in 2008 in Little Cayman. And we were able to respond to that and actually catch that fish. We still have it in a little glass jar here at DOE. But we rapidly realized that by 2009, the invasion had completely began. They were all over. They were well beyond our capacity to be able to respond. So we used the work that other people around the region, REEF, particularly the REEF International Education Foundation, had come up with a pretty well-defined response plan using nets. We have a lot of marine protections here, so there were some complications that it was illegal to catch various species in certain areas, and unfortunately the lionfish fell into that category. So we needed to permit and develop techniques. We championed the net method, catching it with 2 nets, but that rapidly, we realized we needed to expand that. So we moved to a specifically designed SPEAR program that required training and licensing. We then increase that to include diving tourism, so people that could register, get trained and visit could help. We really tried to drive this idea that lionfish were a useful commodity to eat because they really do taste good. There was some threat from ciguatera fish poisoning down in the Eastern Caribbean, but none of that was realized here. So we were able to have it pressed as a kind of a local delicacy, and people were able to cull lionfish and take it to restaurants and enjoy it as a meal, and or sell it to the restaurants for tourists and residents alike to enjoy it. That really drove it. And the cull is a local group that have come together, and yeah, I think it is the 35th. They've done a remarkable job. 2 or 3 times a year they meet, and they have these rodeo style tournaments with lots of cash prizes supported by the local, I think Foster's Food Fair, some of the local businesses support them, and it's a really great event. But yeah, really driving home the fact that people can make a difference. And we have seen that has happened around the Caribbean. The lionfish, certainly in Cayman, hasn't materialized to be such a big threat as it has in other areas. We put that largely down to the culling effort, and to some extent the fact that we have, as I mentioned before, relatively resilient reefs. Invasive species find it hard to get established potentially in well-functioning, healthy ecosystems. Typically an invasive route is during, when it's disturbed. There are other threats that allow that species to increase. So we feel quite good in terms of the lionfish response. We're seeing a drop in the numbers now, whether that's to do with the culling efforts around the Caribbean, or whether it's actually the ecosystem starting to adapt to the presence of lionfish. So that's encouraging to see. So yeah, we really still maintain this idea that they shouldn't be there, and that we've got to get out there and solve the problem, because it's not going to solve itself in anything in a timely manner that we need it to do. So.
Can I jump in on that, Tim? Because I think similarly, the Green Iguana culling program that the Department of Environment has led has also involved that effort with people in the community. So but as you said, for the lionfish program, it involves permitting, it involves making sure there are adequate checks and balances in place. Can you talk a little bit more about that process of bringing the community in as a methodology for addressing invasive species?
Absolutely. So I've steered away from Green Iguana, but literally it's been a massive investment through the Cayman Islands government. I think we're close to spending US $10 million to eradicate 1.4 million iguanas since, I think, 2016, 2017. We've moved to a culling program. So basically there is a bounty on iguanas, but it's been highly managed by our department and by the management company that we've recruited to run this. And the idea, because I mean, traditionally bounties just don't work generally. They the need to run them, and we're seeing some of that in Cayman too. It's really difficult to maintain the momentum you need, but we've been relatively successful here. Like I said, we've removed 1.5 million or 1.4 million iguanas over the last 3 or 4 years, and we've licensed local participants to be involved in this program. You need to sign a contract with government. You need to commit to doing your part to try to keep active, and for that you receive a cash bonus based on the size of the iguana and obviously the amount of iguanas that you bring in. And this is proving really lucrative to lots of sectors of the community. I'm getting into a delicate area here, but the sectors of the community that have the time to go out and catch iguanas, and the idea of $5 or $7 or $10 supplement to their daily income is really quite it's quite appealing. So we are seeing people that ordinarily might not have work finding ways to generate an income, and it's anecdotal because we haven't unfortunately been able to really quantify this, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that we have a good system of marine protected areas there, and when the iguana cull was at its height, most of our problematic poachers, marine life was no longer as lucrative as iguanas were, so they shifted their focus, and that had an added benefit. But it's really interesting. It's stuff that we're learning as we go, but it has taken a massive input, and we were fortunate to have the resources from the government thrown at this to deal with it. And it's still an ongoing problem. We've managed, I think the latest surveys suggest that we've reduced the green iguana population from 1.2 million, now we're down to about 80,000. That's still problematic, because in some of the work that we've done, the annual surveys, we're able to demonstrate that the green iguana, as a true invasive species, has the ability to double its population every year. So it would not take us long to get back to the point where we were, a couple of million iguanas running around. We're at 80,000. We have a target of under 50, or maybe lower to 10, and we're working towards that at the moment. But as Luke mentioned, with the blue iguanas, we've still got a long way to go with the greens, and it's a tough uphill battle as the numbers reduce and the incentives become less appealing, as you can't catch as many iguanas these days. And as Luke mentioned, the green iguana has truly adapted to the cull. It's now extremely skittish. People are finding them increasingly hard to catch. They've moved into much more remote areas. So it's going to be a tough battle towards the final lower numbers that we're trying to achieve.
There's a question in the chat, which I think would be good to touch on, which is the impact of agriculture and invasive species. And obviously there are some, I think, embedded processes that the Department of Agriculture has that play a big role in making sure that some of those crop pests and other issues don't make it into our islands. But the question here is about perhaps farmers working to also reduce those threats. And I think that plays into a larger question about what is the role that, I think Tanya said it, it starts at home. Everyone has a role to play in helping prevent the spread of potentially invasive species. So what are some of the things that the community can do to make sure that we aren't enabling some of these introduction pathways, not perpetuating some of these negative impacts?
Yeah, so that's interesting because farmers have been really badly hit by the green iguana invasion. They really like some of the crops that these farmers are farming, and they have huge impacts to the foliage and so they've had to go to extreme lengths to try to exclude iguanas, but they are very, very adaptable. They're able to scale most fences and get into crops and cause a lot of problems. Since the cull has come about, the number of iguanas has fallen dramatically, and the farmers are noticing already an improvement in crop yields and less impact from the iguanas. So that's encouraging. The unfortunate thing about the role, I think one of the things that the survey, our Green Iguana annual survey, shows is that iguanas really enjoy disturbed habitat. So they enjoy a typical primary habitat. Although iguanas are there, they don't thrive as well as they do in backyards or farm cultured land where the land has been cleared. There's easy access to food, there's easy access to nesting. So the two of them do go hand in hand. But the impact from agriculture, unfortunately, has allowed iguanas to really thrive in those areas that have had their natural habitats removed. So there's a link there too. But the typical methods that farmers employ are costly fences with screening and trying to keep them out. Obviously, there's a move now, I think, in Cayman towards some more different farming practices, the hydroponics, the indoor farming, and I think that hopefully will also relieve some of the stresses that iguanas are putting on crops and the more traditional approaches. But I don't think we'll get away from it entirely. But it is, as you say, it is a community, as Tanya points out. This really requires everybody because there are so many different areas that are interrelated that all feed into this, we've relied heavily on the community to report green iguanas now so that we can deal with the problem as they become more and more scarce. And it really is a collective effort of everybody on the island.
Marique, I don't know if you want to touch on that, or Tanya, and about the role of community engagement in addressing these issues.
Hi, Hannah. Yes. Well, so we've, as Tim has noted, that a lot of these issues are things that can be prevented. So taking preventative measures. So I'll just touch briefly, for example, on one of the invasive species that we haven't mentioned so much, and that is rodents, right? So many people on this panel may be aware that there has been some extensive rodent eradications globally on small islands. However, on an island like ours, which is so densely inhabited, it would be unlikely that would be successful. So in instances like that, you really have to look at other control methods. And one of the things that we would advocate really is sort of an integrated pest management solutions. So the Cayman Islands Department of Environmental Health, for example, has some excellent literature on things that each person in the community can actually do as individuals to take away their sources of food, water, shelter. And this includes things like appropriate waste management and cutting back your excess vegetation, removing derelict vehicles, anything that can provide these animals sort of shelter. And then, of course, as Tim says, rodent and green iguana proofing structures, fences, things like that. So if one leads with a community approach, it's often more effective than actually coming with a after the fact approach. And I mean, we can see it as well. One of the huge things that has caused a lot of this is sort of pet ownership, right? Pet ownership and is at the heart of a lot of these invasive species issues. And it's really important that the community gets on board with responsible pet ownership, especially as it relates to dogs and cats, so that in future, all these implementations we're doing now and all these sort of after the fact controls, they won't mean anything if the problems come back.
Tanya, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would like, you mentioned earlier some like questions about the pathways, like how do invasive species get to the island and between the islands? Like some of them we already mentioned, like you said, the raccoons coming on the barge in containers, but so those are more obvious to us. But we also had some incidents where iguanas just traveled in cars, like they like to go and hide and squeeze into narrow spaces in cars, and this is how they can travel across the whole island, right? But also between the islands. So they are like obviously stowaway is a really important pathway internationally and into island shipping and traveling. And this is also where the public can actually be involved. Like if you're traveling between the islands, to the islands, from the islands, also to protect other countries, make sure that your shoes are clean, right? So if you went hiking, let's say, I don't know, in a different country, and maybe some seeds of plants that were just like squeezed into the soles of your shoes, and then you bring your shoes here and you go hiking again, you spread those seeds, right? So that is another pathway where people can be involved, like personally, where they can take some charge, but also making sure that nothing is hiding in your luggage or on the person, or when you're traveling between islands by boat, that there is nothing hiding in the boat structure or underneath anything anywhere where they can actually hide. So that is quite important. Then another pathway is illegal import. So unfortunately, you would be surprised how much evidence we find that people do smuggle illegal exotic pets into the islands and all over the world, right? So please do not smuggle animals. It feels like I don't have to say that. There is a reason why the government puts rules in place for certain animals that you cannot bring in here, because they have highly invasive potential. So not only the invasive species that we already have here are a threat, but also anything close by or connected to the Cayman Islands that has invasive potential and might even be invasive in other places already. Right. And if you have any exotic pets, or if you find anything, please don't let it go into the wild or ignore it. Please report it to the Department of Environment or the Department of Agriculture. And if you have a pet that you don't want anymore, turn it in. That is always better than letting it loose. And it is also irresponsible and actually against the law to let an invasive species free in the wild. So those are just some things that I wanted to mention where the public can be involved. As Marique said, dispose of your trash responsibly, be a responsible pet owner, and yeah, and at this point, I also would like to thank like everybody in the sister islands, all the volunteers who are fighting tirelessly against the green iguanas that are already in the sister islands, where the bounty system is not has not taken action yet, and everybody is just so passionate about the wildlife in the Cayman Islands, wants to protect it and do their absolute best to fight the invasive species there. So I want to thank the people that have been involved for years, and also everybody new who is interested to join that project. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Luke, there's a specific question in the Q&A for you, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this word correctly. Is homozygosity a particular problem for the blue iguana conservation process?
No, it was a huge risk and concern for us, given the low number of founders that the program was started with. But we've been incredibly fortunate to have, our partnership is made up of experts from DOE from all around the world. But one of those as well is we've worked with geneticists and population management at San Diego Zoo, at Mississippi State University, at Darwin, a number of partners over the years that have ensured that our breeding program has been well managed and meticulously looked at to ensure that that hasn't been an issue for us. So it was dangerously close. You certainly wouldn't want to go any less, but all our evidence and evaluation of the last 51 years shows that no, it has not been an issue for us. But it's always something that we're concerned about, and we're always important that we keep our founder lines going and the representation. Hence, we can't afford disasters such as emerging diseases or any challenges that could negatively impact that. So still sensitive, but no, at the moment, it's a challenge that we're ahead of.
Thanks, Luke. And you touch on the emerging novel diseases, and I do want to touch on that, but while we're in the last sort of 10 minutes of the discussion, it's gone by so quickly, to talk about stony coral tissue loss disease and I think it's the heliobacteria, some of these emerging diseases that we're seeing, and how the Cayman Islands is responding to them. And Tim, I think perhaps if you're able to touch on stony coral tissue loss disease, what we know, what we still don't know, and what some of the ongoing efforts are to address it in Cayman.
Yeah, unfortunately, Hannah, it's one of those scenarios where it's what we don't know. We do know that it's an absolutely devastating disease. Coral reefs have been under a lot of pressure from various different diseases throughout the years. This new one started in Florida in 2014, excuse me. It started in Florida in 2014, and we were watching its progression through the Caribbean. The vectors are not understood, the pathways are not understood. And eventually by 2020, June 2020, we got our first report of the disease on the north coast of Grand Cayman. And then we went through lockdown, we monitored it. By a year later, it had spread completely around the entire island. We're fortunate that it has not yet arrived in the sister islands. So Little Cayman, Cayman Brac remain, for reasons that we just don't understand, they remain clear of it. But it's a horrible disease that infects about 20% of some of the 20 species of some of the primary coral habitat builders, our big boulder corals, the corals that really build the reef, the habitat, the structure that the fish and all the other invertebrates and communities depend upon. The mortality rate is huge. It's like pretty much 100% for most of the corals that are infected. And we see just rapid loss of coral diversity in a matter of months, this is unprecedented. Coral diseases have been prevalent before, but the difference with this one is the amount of species that it impacts and the rate with which it spreads, and the actual mortality, the amount of corals that succumb to it is likely to be devastating. We have had a massive intervention based primarily on the experience that Florida went. Florida was criticized for taking a very long time to respond. We didn't take that. We took that lesson on board, and we were able to benefit. And we, with help from the government funds in Cayman and from international funding from the UK, we are able to mount a massive response against this. And we're ongoing right now. We're using, rather controversially, we're using antibiotics to treat the disease. As I mentioned before, people don't know what the actual pathogen is. Is it a virus or is it a bacterial? It responds very well to antibiotics, so maybe that's the secondary impact. So we just don't know enough about it yet, but we have a team of trained people that are working with the department. We have volunteers that are doing the observations. We have a lot of people working really hard to try to minimize the impact. There's no hope of preventing it, but we're minimizing some of the higher priority corals. I'm very happy to report that just in September is the annual spawning season, and a lot of the corals that had been infected and treated, some of the larger corals were happily spawning away. So recruitment is a big drive at this point. And although we haven't prevented the spread of the disease, we've certainly reduced its impact to a lot of some of the large corals. So it's been a success in that regard. But again, as with everything that we've mentioned today, a long way to go and a lot of effort still required.
We're in our last 5 minutes, so I think what I'll do is just starting with you, Tim. Just if we can go through each panelist and just any closing thoughts you want to leave our audience with today.
Yeah, it's always a shame that these we're targeted with so much bad news. So everything seems to be a struggle. There's, like we say, we mentioned the stony coral tissue loss. We got the helicobacter. Now we have the diadema, the long-spined urchin also succumbing to a reintroduction of a pathogen when it was just recovering. It does seem to me that there are, it's just one thing after the next, but there are people willing, and there are groups willing, and there are communities willing to make a difference if we can galvanize them to do so, to give them the resources, give them the opportunity. So I'm really encouraged by that. When you ask for help, when you ask for responses, you get it. And that keeps me going. People are, and we can make a difference. So I just encourage everybody that keeps working in this field to draw on the resources that the public can bring and that people will want to bring to this. So, and thank you again for today.
Thank you, Tim. Luke?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Tim said. I'm very fortunate, I think, to be part of a partnership leading the Blue Iguana program. And I don't think there's a better example of conservation optimism. If you just spoke to anyone in the early 2000s, this species was gone. It was functionally extinct. It was too late. And we've shown through hard work, determination, and when everybody goes in the same direction and wants to see change, that no matter how bleak things look, you can come back from a really low bar. And I would encourage people to be motivated by that, hear the cautionary tales of the blue iguanas that this can happen if we don't act, and that although 31 years later we're still acting, and they will be conservation dependent for a long time and will always need some degree of support. But I think they're a great example that no matter how bleak things seem, we can move forward. And I would just encourage everybody to engage and support these initiatives. They can be difficult, they can be emotive topics, but conversations like this are vital to ensuring that we continue to move forward. Work with all of us as organizations and as communities, come and discuss challenges and barriers, and let's all move forward before it's too late to be able to affect things. But thank you everybody for tuning in, and to all the amazing partners and panelists that have been here today. It's a really important topic and a really great time to be talking about it.
Thanks, Luke. Marique?
Thanks. Just as well, echo what Luke said. In terms of just keep having the conversations, we need to normalize some of these sensitive topics, and it's vital that we do at this time. And I feel very fortunate to live and work in the Cayman Islands, which is really an island where the Department of Environment, National Trust are sort of leaders in conservation, and where this island really prioritizes nature. And I would just encourage people as well, volunteer as much as you can, find out what you can do, because every person, it's very cliche, but it is the truth. On small islands, individuals can make a difference. So thank you very much for letting us speak here today.
Thank you, Marique. Tanya?
Yeah, there's not much left to say. Thank you very much. But from a biosecurity point of view, I am just so happy to see that we don't start from zero. The Cayman Islands have been great. Everybody I've been talking to, all the stakeholders and the public, is very, very supportive over coming up with a biosecurity plan to protect all three of the Cayman Islands. And the DOA the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environment have been working really so hard already in the past, mainly focusing on agricultural significant diseases and pests. And working together, I am absolutely sure that we can come up with a plan that involves invasive species and vertebrates and marine, and we just have to keep talking, working together, and we will surely come up with something great. Thank you very much for having us today, and thanks to everybody else for these discussions. I had much fun.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining today. It was really, I think this is a great example of the level of collaboration we have locally. And I am excited for us to be able to share more news about these initiatives in the future. I think now I'll hand back over to Stacey to wrap up the panel. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Marie, Tanya, Tim, Luke. I mean, I learned so much, and I really want to say an amazing thank you to the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience of the Cayman Islands. This was an extremely informative presentation. It was great to see, ending on a note of optimism and showing how important collaboration is. So thanks very much to everyone, and I wish you all an incredible afternoon. Thank you so much. Thanks for all of your contributions. Bye.